Okay, folks. Happy to see so many of you here today. This is a part of this kind of occasional lecture series called OASIS Talks, and today we're super happy to, or I'm super happy to introduce Chris Paul, who's an associate professor at Seattle University. Chris is a versatile scholar, especially a pioneer in applying rhetorical analysis to video games. Hence, check out his prior book, Wordplay.
Discourse of video games.
Yeah, okay, there you go. But I mean, today, Chris is here to talk about his brand new book, which is something different.
It is.
And yeah, I live too. But I mean, yeah, cheers. Super happy to have you.
Thanks, Ollie. So I want to say thanks to Ale and Franz and Jaco and all the folks around me out and are living, and for you guys for coming. So this project came about because I became interested in how meritocracy gets baked into games, how it's just there and how we don't really think about it, what that means for who plays games and what games get made, how we interact with each other, what happens in game culture. I was really interested in why the culture around games gets so nasty. And I want to focus in this talk mainly on stuff that's not in the book, because I figured that you can read that if you're interested. This work started with a presentation I gave at the Canadian Game Studies Association conference in 2013. But to start, I kind of need to start where multiplayer games start. So I suspect that many of you know about Richard Bartle's Mud. That was basically the forerunner of all kinds of online games that we have now, the World of Warcraft and things like that. And these are quotes that he gave to Lee Alexander after GDC in 2010. In Mud, there was nothing stopping you from going up a level because you were a girl or because you were slightly socially inept or because you were from the north of England. It was a kind of meritocracy where everyone could succeed. And then it had this fascinating context, Alexander adds, two angry young men feeling oppressed, creating an escape with their own two hands, a place where the laws were fair, where the experience was not so uncommon. I thought that this was really interesting, and it was really interesting to me, at least in part, because these are two white men of means in a powerful country talking about the fact that they find life unsatisfying and that they need to create a virtual world that's more fair to them, which they experience all kinds of structural privilege throughout their life. It ignores any kind of imbalance in online worlds based on computer knowledge or access or who gets access. So it might not be balanced if you're from the north of England, but it may be balanced against you if you don't have the money to have a computer and have internet access and be able to do these things in the late 70s and early 80s. So it privileges a particular kind of access, a particular kind of skill, a particular kind of cachet. And that's kind of where online games start. So to really understand how I got here, I think I need to take a little step back to step forward. And the place where I step back is to talk a little bit about my experience as a scholar. And when I got to Seattle University, they do reviews in the United States in order to move you toward tenure. And one of the reviews I got was very early in my time at Seattle University. And they review you on your research, your teaching, and your service. And all of my research, teaching, and service were really good. But at the place where I'm at, it's also known as a mission-driven university. And so I didn't know that because I had always been at places that didn't do that before. So I didn't say anything about it. And the first thing that they say is, what are you about the mission? You didn't talk enough about the mission. And I'm like, oh my goodness, I'm doing all this other stuff. Why do you need me to talk about this? And I don't know how it works here, but in the United States, where once you get that noted in your file, it means that every subsequent letter is then going to talk about the thing that they talked about before, because they know the one thing to talk about. So in my next file, it was like, why didn't you talk about the mission? Or you need to talk more about the mission, or you talked a little bit more about the mission. So this is the one not going forward in my tenure process. And if my research is in line, and my teaching is in line, and my service is in line, I didn't want to lose my tenure track position over mission fit. So it comes to this point where this thing happens where right before I go up for tenure, the year I would go up for tenure, the head of mission and ministry at Seattle University sends out this bulk email to the campus inviting people to this seminar. That's 15 mornings, 2-hour mornings over the course of the year. And I do what I do to all kinds of emails that are mailed to all of campus. I quickly deleted it. And I'm like, I don't need to look at that. And then the next week, I got an email that said, Dear Chris, I would like to invite you to, and I'm like, crap. There's really no way to get out of this at this point. This is the one knock on me, and you've invited me. And so it was strange and it was interesting, but it was this thing called the Arube Seminar, and it was about nation reflection and how the mission should be integrated in the kinds of stuff that we do. And I went at the first couple and I'm like, this is just, I don't know. I don't know if this is for me. I will sit through it. I will check the box. I will be able to say this in my file. But then I started to read more. So this is Pedro Arrupe and Hans Koldenbach. They're two famous Jesuits. And there's this thing that we read at the end. It's this letter that the speech that Hans Koldenbach delivered at Santa Clara. And he talks about a handful of things. He talks about the thing about Ignatian spirituality, Ignatian higher ed, is there are 3 keys to it. The first thing is you should start studying where your heart is. So you should work where your heart is. The things that motivate you, that should be what you look at. The second thing is that scholars that are lucky enough to be at institutions like this have an obligation to make change. That they're obligated to address structural issues of privilege. It's a different kind of thing than working in a state school. I'm obligated to do something. And that you need to consider alternative perspectives. He also has this great quote near the end where he makes this argument that the way the mind is most likely to change is through direct experience. And he's thinking about going out and doing mission work, but I'm like, dude, if we think about your mind can be changed through direct experience, he's talking about video games. He's actually talking about video games right now. And so like this is filtering through what I think, but I found it really interesting and I started to reflect. Another thing that I started to reflect on is my first book, which Ollie was kind enough to mention, right? Which is published with Routledge, which has a very particular business model. And Routledge was very nice to me. The book gives me credit. It's great. It helped me get tenure. It's going to help me get full professor. That's wonderful. It also came out with a hardcover copy that cost almost $150. Right? So their whole business model is based on selling it to libraries and be able to recoup money that way. In 2013 was the biggest year for revenue. They made over $2,000 on the book. I got $42. So it's also a structural imbalance. And the bigger issue is not necessarily the money, because I don't think anybody goes into academic publishing for the money. It's a question of the fact that it cost so much money meant that it didn't get read. Right? And so now I'm thinking about what do I need to do with the next project in order to make sure that I don't do this, especially if I have the relative security of tenure already. Then I thought about this notion of tenure, right? And at least in the United States, it's dwindling. More and more of my colleagues don't have it. And if you do have it, I started to think about the fact that where's my heart and what's my obligation and what can I do now that I have tenure that I potentially couldn't have done before? So what can I say that somebody else might not be able to say? And then I thought about diversity and the fact that video games is a really not diverse space. This is a map on the bottom right done by Eric Fisher, and that's Seattle. And it's all of the people in Seattle coded for race. And if you notice, like, there's this area of Seattle which is really has a lot of different colored dots, but the vast majority of Seattle is those red dots. That's because it's overwhelmingly white. If we don't have diversity, we're going to limit what we are able to get. Game designers are overwhelmingly white and male. Console and core gamers are overwhelmingly white and male. And other kinds of games are sometimes more diverse. So what can we say about that? And I started thinking about some scholars, and I suspect that you recognize some of these people. One of them is in the room, and so it's nice to talk about her too. And the kind of work that they were doing, and what kinds of things that I might be able to say that anchors into this. And then as I'm working on this project, Gamergate happened in 2014, right? And these women get harassed as part of Gamergate, and we can certainly talk about more of that in question and answer. It's an important story, and a lot of it's in the book. But you know, you've got Zoe Quinn and Anita Sarkeesian and Brianna Wu, and you have all of these horrible things happen that make me question my relationship with games and what's my obligation to try to change things. And thinking about games, right? And Lee Alexander wrote this about sexism in games in the wake of Gamergate. This female Overwatch thing happened earlier this year, where this Overwatch host wrote this really like, "Thank you, men, for supporting us, for helping to make the world a better place," and gets death threats for like what was a really like on the list of feminism to not. This was closer to not than feminism, and oh my goodness, death threats. Arthur Chu, Jeopardy champion and cultural critic, wrote about games that. Gamers are convinced that their opinion is objectively correct. And I think this is a really interesting thing going on, that things that are values are stated as fact rather than treated as values. So reflecting on this, I think that games often try to go to technical solutions to cultural problems. We do things like bans, we do things like tribunals, we do things like being able to build a system that sorts people to a particular place or another. And if it's a cultural problem, I make the argument that it needs a cultural solution. So what kinds of things can we do to address the underlying concepts behind games and start to fix the culture around games? Because those things are going to need culture change rather than just technical fixes. So I want to go away to come back at these a little bit. And I don't know if you know about this. I don't know if this became a thing in Finland, but this is Hairdryer Chicken. Does anybody know about Hairdryer Chicken? This became a thing on the interwebs. And it's a New Yorker food critic who one snow day decided to use her Dyson hairdryer to dry out the skin on a chicken to then make it crispier when she cooked it. Now, she's an accomplished food writer. She's done a bunch of stuff. She works for a prominent publication. This is a technique that's been used in cooking chicken frequently, not necessarily with a Dyson hairdryer, but the idea of drying out the skin to make it crispier, not particularly controversial. And then, of course, the interweb gets a hold of it. And once the interweb gets a hold of it, it changes and it morphs. And the fact that this is a $400 hairdryer becomes a thing. And she goes from being like an accomplished New Yorker food writer, and she eventually assigns herself the Twitter handle of woman, because she just gets started talking about, and all of her credentials are just washed out of it. There are hundreds of articles written online about Hairdryer Chicken, and only one of them bothered to interview her, and that was the one for Allure magazine. Everybody else just wrote about this because people were getting clicks on this. And there's this wonderful article on The Verge about how this happened and how this went about. And I knew things went viral in different kinds of ways, and I knew this happened on the internet, and then it happened to me. So I got this email in the wake of the publication of my book from a person that's like, could you answer some questions about your book? And I'm like, sure. What do you work for? And I looked up this website, and it was clearly a conservative website. So I'm like, okay, I have two choices here. One, I could not answer her questions, in which case she's going to go ahead and write her story anyway, and then I'm not a person, right? Or two, I could try to answer the questions to my best of my ability and hope through good faith, she engages me. And she did an okay job. Like we clearly disagree, but she used my quotes accurately, and it was student journalism level publication. Then I find this is at the bottom of my article. So they're fundraising off my article to end the liberal bias in higher education. And it gets shared about 2,000 times. But then what happens becomes really interesting to me, because it starts to get Hairdryer Chickened a little bit. So then after she interviews me and did her work as a journalist to interview me, other people in the conservative blogosphere start to write about it. And this is when it starts to get fun. So I then become trying to get rid of hard work. I'm averse to competition. I become liberal professor, right? Like now I'm liberal, and it gets even better, right? So this is just the beginning. Then it gets to the fact that I become blasting toxic meritocracy and things about that. I'm on Reddit, SJW hate. I suspect most of the folks in here know social justice warriors, right? Well, the thing that I love about this community, right, is you have to subscribe to it in order to participate. So, right, the social justice warrior hate people are so afraid of the free speech that they claim that you have to register with them to actually participate in their community, which is, things. I'm blasting more competition. Then, it gets good, right? So this is for Milo Yiannopoulos' site at the top, right? So Ian Miles Chong came out in favor of the Gamergators, got a deal with Yiannopoulos. Incel corner, right? Involuntarily celibate, right? So I can't get the ladies either. I become gender studies professor, right? So it's a leap from liberal to now gender studies, because now it's about masculinity too, because I attack competition in games, it becomes about whether or not I'm a man. And this one I love, right? It becomes sexist, racist, homophobic. I never would have heard, and I posit no one else here would have either, of this embarrassment to manhood if it were for the attempt to show how lame he is. I think it might be better if it were that way for everyone, right? So now it's about my manhood and me not showing myself, and that I need to prove myself in competition. It's getting fun, right? So then I start getting emails too, right? And that's exciting. I like this one. It's the gayest thing they've ever read, right? So again, we're going to the homophobia and the masculinity. My personal favorite of this one is the line at the end, also your wife is banging Tyrone, which is a racist slur, right? And when I brought this up to my partner, Erin, I said, I showed it to her, and her immediate response was, who's Tyrone? And I'm like, I should be asking you that. That's a question for you, lady. So then this one came up, and this is my favorite chat thread of all of them. It's a really benign title, and then it comes into the body of the text, and then it just lashes out in all kinds of ways. And it pulls from some of my other stuff that they clearly Google searched, but didn't actually talk to me. And this is for a website. Are you familiar with the Breitbart here in Philly? Right, the Steve Bannon Breitbart? So that happened, and then what happened is it started trending on Breitbart. That's a 5-arrow kind of thing to happen. All day, one day, it was trending on Breitbart. And then the really fun emails came. So this is from the chat thread, right? They became really interested in the fact that I had a PhD and I taught classes. So it became this thing where in the comments thread, it became like, why don't you just give your job at someone at random, because your PhD doesn't matter anyway. Or you clearly must give everybody A's, which I had to disabuse my students of that notion. No, it doesn't absolutely matter. Right? Does everyone get an A in this class? So insulting me again, insulting my intelligence. I like this one, that Seattle became an alt-left cesspool. They start misspelling things. It's fantastic. One of my favorite emails is this one. It starts, "Dear fellow Americans." This was sent to me, the Republican National Committee, and the Democratic National Committee, just to lump in all the Americans. It comes attached at the top with his name, address, and phone number, just in case I want to get in touch. I've cut that out because I didn't feel it was appropriate to share here. Then here's the part of the body of the email. And I don't know if you're familiar with Godwins Law. Everything on the internet sooner or later gets to Nazis. We've gone Godwins Law, right? Like, so now I'm bringing back Hitler and Mao through my critique of meritocracy. And my personal favorite thing about this email, the thing that brings this email home, is the way he signed off. Because he signed off recently. Like, this is fantastic. So then Amazon happened. Like, one stuff's happening, and then they show up on the Amazon, and the Gamergaters have gotten really good at the Amazon. So all kinds of negative reviews on Amazon. One of the things that I love about this, though, that my friends started to fight back, right? And you can see literary fiction, the people that actually read the books, they love me. Other people, not so much. The sports books, PC hardware, I'm really unfavorable to people who like PC hardware. But if you want to do your little strike against Gamergate, go out and give my book 5 stars and hit the helpful, not helpfuls as you should, right? You should read it first, though. It's supposed to be an OASIS lab after it gets back from the library, because apparently it's stuck in library stuff right now. Good stuff happened, too. Let's just take a moment to appreciate the best trolling email I got. This book is the stupidest thing I've ever read in my life. I actually could not finish it because I started to lose my ability to read. The unintelligible finger paintings I made as a 2-year-old are more logically constructed. There will always be a best and there will always be a worst. This is the worst. Nothing could possibly be more stupider, maybe even the sentence, "You are the anti-Shakespeare." 80% of academia is a complete joke, just like this book. I can now write off virtually any study conducted by a liberal arts professor. Thank you. And so, henceforth, I shall be known as the anti-Shakespeare. Good stuff happened, too. A couple years ago, Chris Hayes wrote a book on, the MSNBC host, wrote a book on meritocracy a few years ago. We tweeted back and forth at one point, and then, like, nothing happened. And then I tweeted at him and after the book came out, and, well, he retweeted it. And when that happened, it got seen by a whole lot of people. Now, 2 pro tips. Wait until the Kindle version of your Amazon book is out before you tweet at the MSNBC host, because you're only going to get 1 shot. The second thing, link to Amazon and not the University of Minnesota Press, so it just makes it a little bit more of a seamless transaction. And one of my favorite things that happened out of this is I got subtweeted, right? Like, oh, those jerks keep telling me the Get Good guy is going to go on MSNBC because he can embarrass himself, and he's not even citing me, so I'm getting subtweeted and I'm bringing Godwins Law back. It's fantastic. So now, that's kind of what happened. So you can, I kind of can feel I hit a nerve with this project, and I got to kind of explain what I needed to do. So what the kinds of things that we need to do is we need to talk a little bit about meritocracy and how it works. Meritocracy wasn't always this way. It wasn't always so baked into Western culture. The term was actually coined, popularized in a 1958 dystopian British novel. That the author of the novel is opposed to meritocracy. He thinks meritocracy is a terrible thing. That by the end of his novel espousing a meritocratic context, the meritocratic narrator is killed in a revolution by the people that rise up to reject it. But critiquing it clearly makes people recoil. It made me uncomfortable. It's made several people who've heard me talk about it uncomfortable. It's hard. But when this stuff is going on, we often don't talk about the structure of games or how we think about them. What can we find if we look there? And if I think about my notion from the Arupe seminar and the kinds of things that I learned by reflecting on Jesuit mission, right? It's a notion of what's my obligation as a critic? What's our obligation in this room in order to try to make change, to try to make something different, to try to do something else? So meritocracy, boiling it down. I make the argument in the book that game design and game narratives are typically meritocratic, that video games are an actualized meritocratic space where we valorize meritocracies in both the way that games are built and the kinds of stories that we tell in them. If you think about the basic story in a game, it's typically somebody starting out at the bottom, and through the player's intervention, they reach the top by the end. Grand Theft Auto, Legend of Zelda, all kinds of games follow this path, basically every MMO ever. Right? And then the design conceits are also meritocratic. They're spaces where we expect skill to win, where we expect skill to win out. If you think about the revulsion that many hold toward free-to-play games, free-to-play games are revolting to many simply because they don't let skill win, right? They let money win. That somebody can beat me because they have a bigger pocketbook than I do, and that's not okay. So if you think about tropes like the best should win, skill should conquer, you should play or train harder, the game should be a fair battle. The Get Good framework, right? The Get Good framework that all these people turn against me, right? Get Good is precisely meritocratic, right? And the notion of Get Good is something that's also isolationist and really toxic, right? Instead of this communal obligation to teach, right? It's an obligation for you individually to get good, and when you do, you can come back, right? I think that's interesting, right? That video games become a space that are actualized meritocracies. They're meritocracy realized, and that has has some real issues, right? Because it doesn't let us focus on structural barriers. It doesn't let us talk about who gets encouraged to play, or when they get encouraged to play, or under what circumstances they're encouraged to play. Who has the chance to do this in the first place? So some quotes about meritocracy and how it works, right? This is from Michael Young, the guy who coins the term, in a 2001 follow-up as he sees Britain further going down the meritocratic path. The advancement of under meritocracy, we get started to focus on how the advancement comes from their own merits. You can feel like you deserve whatever you get. The newcomers can actually believe they have morality on their side. The older strengths of the business world have been lifted. So basically, the old way that we did business, under an aristocratic model, everybody knew that the prince was the prince only because he was the son of the king or queen, right? He didn't earn that. He just was born into that. Whereas under meritocracy, when we become successful, we start to think that we did this and stop focusing on the other kinds of people that help bring us through, or the circumstances that help get us to where we are. Chris Hayes talks about this, and what he's referencing is the elite school that he went to in New York used to be a school, it's a school you have to test into, and it used to be racially similar to all of New York City. And now it's basically only white kids, because now there's test prep. And so there's test prep for the youngest kids, grade school kids in the United States. So we're talking like 5 to 12. And the moment you start introducing test prep, families of means are way more likely to get their kids into that school than the whole, right? We're no longer testing for merit. We're testing for what kinds of structures you have to prop these kids up to be able to get in the school in the first place. I'm thinking about skill transfer and things like that, and how that works in games, right? He also talks about the fact that Hypergirl Competition works under the notion that we're all playing from the same rule, that there's a fairness to the social contract, and the system basically manages to confer the most benefits on the most deserving. But the moment that starts to break down, the moment the system starts to get rigged, the moment those things happen, the moment some people have an advantage in one game because they played a lifetime of other games, right? And if you've ever taught a games class that has people in it who haven't played as many games, and they start immediately behind the 8 ball in comparison to the kids who played games their whole lives, you start to see interesting things happen. Bernanke, the former Federal Reserve Chair at Princeton, in a commencement speech, talked about the fact that meritocracy needs to focus on the luckiest. The luckiest are the folks who reap the largest rewards. Those who are the luckiest in all of those respects also have the greatest responsibility to work hard to contribute to the betterment of others and to share their luck with others. This is an interesting twist on meritocracy, right? That if we are successful, we have an obligation to pay it back because we've gotten ahead through things that are not necessarily related to us. So I think a lot about luck and the notion that luck works. This book on the right is written by a Cornell professor, and it's all about meritocracy. And the kind of thing that he talks about is that luck wins out in almost every economic modeling over skill and hard work. So that if you think, and he's done all kinds of social scientific studies, and what he's found is that the difference between the most skilled and the second most skilled is minimal. The difference between the hardest working and the second hardest working is minimal. And the difference between the most lucky and the second most lucky can be immense. And that means that when you start to look at these things, luck almost always trumps skill or hardworking. The people who win are skilled and they are hardworking, but they're also really, really lucky. He studies the fact that with things like movie reviews and music reviews, the first reviewer you get is incredibly important. Because if that reviewer likes the book, there's likely a snowball effect that comes on after it, or if they like the song that they played. So it not only matters who you get, but what song they listen to first and all of that, and then you become successful and go on to an awesome career. Thinking about the quotes that I shared, right? They're all from powerful white men, right, that have access to publishing systems. Michael Young, in the first place, sent his book out that coins the term meritocracy, or popularizes the term meritocracy. It gets turned down by dozens of publishers. Then it ends up getting published because he met a childhood friend on a beach vacation who happened to work for a publisher. So, right, it's nepotism combined with wealth to have a beach vacation in the first place that enables him to get there because all of the systems up until that point had told him no. I'm thinking about things like, why do we think we earned it when we win at games? The games that we study are often predicated on meritocratic design and what we can do about it. Why do we lose focus on other kinds of games and what can we do to disturb things? So thinking about 3 specific examples, right? Paul Finch is a psychologist who has studied how structural privilege impacts people. And one of the things that he's done is he's had people play a rigged game of Monopoly. And in a rigged game of Monopoly, he starts one person out with a bunch of extra stuff, and the other person doesn't get it. And what he's found inevitably is the person who started out with the extra stuff becomes a jerk. And the reason they became a jerk is because they're winning. And they don't think about the fact that the only reason they're winning is because he gave them extra money and extra properties at the beginning and rigged the game. We just stopped thinking about this. Star Power is a game from the 1970s that's designed as a kind of LARPy, Yakawi kind of thing. And you get together in a group and you're divided into groups. And in these groups, some people are given powers to remake the game, and you've got these social structures. And what almost inevitably happens in each of these games is the people at the top start making rules to advantage themselves. And by the end of the game, the people at the bottom have disconnected from the game. They don't care about the game anymore, and they can't articulate why they don't. And the people at the top can't articulate that they've been jerks and completely dominated and domineered the game. Right? The game's set up to not make you reflect. The game's set up to make us reflect on meritocracy in different kinds of ways. And then there's some awesome social scientific work by these two women named Shannon McCoy and Brenda Major. And what they found is that meritocratic cues lead us to defend the status quo even if we don't believe in it. So they found in a variety of different places that at the moment that you start thinking about anything meritocratic, about skills should win, about hard work should be valorized, things like that, it automatically induces system justifying responses from us, even if we're systematically disadvantaged under a meritocracy. Right? It's the way we kind of work. It's when you start talking about this stuff, when you're critiquing this stuff, people go, that's hard. Like, that's difficult, right? It's the kind of people that then email me when this stuff shows up on Breitbart. So I would argue that video games of all kinds are set up to give us these meritocratic cues, and it's no wonder it puts us in that kind of framework. So I started to think about luck in other kinds of contexts, and this is a sports context, and you have Finland's own Lori Markkinen down in the corner, because I had to at least give you a little bit, right? The Finn in the NBA was like basically the only good thing happening for the Chicago Bulls. But Daryl Morey, the GM of the Rockets, talks extensively about the fact that winning in the NBA is more about luck than about skill. You have to be good, but you have to be able to make moves at certain points in time in order to be lucky. And when you get to the playoffs, it really matters. The NCAA basketball tournament, which is one of the most lucrative events in the United States for sports, is a single elimination tournament. Any single elimination tournament is more about luck than about skill. Right? It's about what teams you hit, who gets injured when, and who simply manages to have some sort of alarming thing happen in their favor or not. Sandy Koufax talked extensively about the fact that a perfect game is determined by luck. You need things to go for you. It's not just pitching really well, it's luck is able to happen. And of course, the Bulls didn't expect what they got with Lori Markkinen. They got lucky, right? Because Finns can actually play basketball, apparently. So video games, on the other hand, I would argue are generally designed to eliminate luck. Right? We set them up to make luck as small of a part of video games as we can. We do things like theory crafting and metagaming and anti-cheat software in order to limit the role that luck plays, to try to get to the law of large numbers, where if something bad is happening to us, we repeat it over and over and over again until it starts to work out, and we start to get the numbers to work for us. We talk about the notion of perfect game differently than Sandy Koufax does. We talk about it in the notion of actually technically perfect execution rather than perfect because everything went for us and things broke in our favor. So the elimination of luck, I believe, makes us focus on how we should have won, how we earned our victory, how we should have earned our victory. We try to eliminate cheating largely to enable that level playing field so we can have a test for who's the best on this field of combat rather than who just got lucky at this particular point in time. And through that, games become an idealized meritocracy, a meritocracy in action, and that starts to build a system in which we're, of course, going to have a nasty culture. So I think this is me as a kid. I think about the fact that we in this room are exceptionally lucky, right? We're talking about video games right now. How cool is that, right? Like, if I could seriously go back to 12-year-old Chris in this picture, I'd be like, okay, here's what's going to happen. You're going to grow up. You're going to teach people, and you're going to be in Finland talking about video games. I don't know that I would have known what to do. Like, time traveler Chris would have clearly been lying to me. Like, that thing doesn't exist, right? We are incredibly lucky. I get to do this for a living. It's awesome, right? But that luck comes with an obligation, right? What do we do? What do we need to do? What's our obligation? How do we need to pay it back? So because, like, one of the things that happened, and I'm overcompensating, right? These are all the games that are mentioned in the book. So I talk about plenty of different games in the book. Just trust me on that. You can read it whatevs. But I want to talk about a couple of specific examples. So one, I want to talk about Guguri, right? This is the most famous, highest achieving, awesome woman Overwatch player in the world. She's fantastic. She plays Zarya and D.Va as a secondary tank. And when she first started to become prominent on the Overwatch scene, two men questioned the fact that she surely couldn't be that good for two reasons. One, they didn't know her in advance. She wasn't part of their nepotistic system. She came out of nowhere to them. And second of all, she uses her mouse in a different way than other people, and it looks a little twitchy to them, and they didn't believe it. So they said they would bet their careers on the fact that she was cheating. So she had to go on Korean TV to prove that she wasn't cheating, right? She faced structural barriers from the beginning that those dudes never faced, that if she was a dude, she probably wouldn't face. Then, when she started to drop the Overwatch League, through the first season of Overwatch League, she wasn't included. And team owners explicitly said the reason she wasn't included is they were worried what it would do to team cohesion, right? Which is subtext for, we're worried about having a girl on our team, right? She faces different obligations and different structural barriers. It's not about an idealized meritocracy. It's about the structural privileges you face, and not the least of which is what goes down. So this next one is after she does get signed, and in advance of her first one, she starts to get really nervous and starts tweeting things. And one of the things that she tweets is, Gaguri means frog, right? She's like, you should call me Toad because when I'm stressed, I binge. She's worried about what she's going to look like on camera. So she's facing a very different kind of obligation than all the dudes that don't have to worry about that. She's not only playing Overwatch, she's playing all of these other structural barriers that we've built into society. So, of course, we could look at some other people that play professional Overwatch. There's this guy, right? Did you hear about this story? Right, he's soliciting teens. There's some milkshake stock, all the racism and sexism that have come out where they've had to ban or drop people. Dallas Fuel say what? Then, of course, it wasn't just one girl, it was more than one girl. So, right, these people can get Overwatch contracts. Gaguri, who's probably better than both of them, can't until they really need her. Then the other thing that we could talk about in Overwatch is Mercy. Mercy's a really interesting character to me. There's all kinds of interesting stuff, right? This is Mercy in the game. This is concept art for Mercy. It's notable to me that, right, one is a marginalized group of women, one is a marginalized group of a black man, and Mercy's a healer in a first-person shooter, which makes her necessarily contentious. She's a healer that undoes the work that other people have done, which I think makes shooter fans uncomfortable. Her resurrection skill was particularly contentious, and people got really antsy about that. They also talk about, players also talk about at length the fact that they consider Mercy a low skill cap hero, right? That you can't be skilled to play Mercy. It's easy to play Mercy. Anybody could do it. That's at least in part because it's the wrong kind of skill. So we start to talk about Mercy's an example of poor design. We talk about why does everyone hate her. We talk about the tug of war between casual and competitive Overwatch. And then we get this person who now plays for the New York Excelsior and is an outstanding Mercy player. He says his solution is to play Mercy selfishly. He's a shot caller for the team. He's one of the most successful players in the world. And this selfishness is really interesting to me. And part of the reason why this selfishness is interesting to me is he's trying to play it within a meritocratic context, right? Now, he's really, really good at it, but he's giving credit for playing Mercy in a way that I don't think a woman playing the same way would be given credit. What's some other ways to think about games? What can we do? One of the things that I like to think about is potentially the Olympics. And in the Olympics, you know, we've got the Tongan, right, who did the summer and the winter Olympics. I don't know if he was as big as deal in Finland as he was in the United States. He was all over the United States, right? He did a summer Olympic event. He did a winter Olympic event. He didn't wear a shirt to the opening ceremonies. The internet went nuts. We have Gabby Douglas. We have a woman named Elizabeth Swaney. Did Elizabeth Swaney make it over here, right? She's the half-pipe skier who didn't do tricks. Right? Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And we have the Finnish hockey team, right? So I want to talk about each of these in turn, right? So the Tongan athlete, and I'm gonna probably butcher his name, Pita Taufatotu. Yeah. I'm sorry, Pita. But he's the beneficiary of what's called inclusion places. The Olympics have inclusion places, and the point of an inclusion place is to be able to bring the Olympics to places that wouldn't have it otherwise. So the standards for an inclusion athlete are generally lower than other places in order to get more people, more countries participating in the Olympics. Those have also often worked to then revitalize that sport in the country where it was, right? So that's a really cool thing that they're doing to add diversity to the Olympics, expand the reach of the Olympics, and potentially start sports in places where they wouldn't otherwise. Gabby Douglas was known at the Rio Olympics as the third best American gymnast. She also happened to probably be the third best gymnast in the world, but she didn't get to compete in the all-around because of the fact that only 2 gymnasts from any country get to participate in the all-around. And because of that, the third best gymnast in the world didn't get to compete for a medal because of Olympic rules. The same thing happens to Brazilian women's beach volleyball players, Chinese table tennis players, probably Canadian curlers, but that's not a real sport, so we don't really care anymore. Picking on the Canadians in the room because it's fun. Elizabeth Swaney, right, gets mercilessly mocked because she's effectively exploited a loophole. She's an American who originally starts competing for Venezuela, then switches to Hungary. And throughout this process, what she finds is her lifelong dream is to compete in the Olympics. So she finds that the way that you compete in the halfpipe at the Olympics is you need to compete, place in the top 30 at a certain number of events. And the trick about the women's halfpipe is there often aren't 30 women competing in the halfpipe. So if you simply show up You've got your top 30 that can then get you in the Olympics. This is fantastic levels of metagaming, right? She gave up her life. She sacrificed things. She flew to these competitions. She competed the best that she could, and she ends up in the Olympics, and then we make fun of her. Hockey at this last Olympics, which I've heard the Finns care about hockey somewhat, so yeah, hockey. I don't know so much, but like you got this thing with the NHL wouldn't release their players for the hockey tournament for the Olympics, right? So the Olympics no longer becomes about the best hockey tournament in the world. It becomes about whether or not Russia can, or organized athletes from Russia, because Russia was banned, right? Whether the OAR can win a gold medal because their league will shut down and they can send most of their best players. And Canada and the United States and Sweden and others have players playing in the NHL who can't get freed up. And just in case you wanted to see an actual gold medal winning hockey team, right? There's the U.S. women who did win a gold medal. Thank you, Canada. Then if we get back to video games, have you played the game XCOM? One of the things that's really interesting to me about XCOM is the XCOM designers have spoken explicitly about the fact that the accuracy of the roll that you see, right, an 80% chance at making the shot is a lie. And the reason it's a lie is because gamers don't believe in 80%. They believe 80% is like 90%, and 90% is like 95%, and 95% is 100%. So what they were finding is the gamers were getting incredibly pissed off when their roll of 80% wouldn't hit, which if you play on a long map, odds over time, it's not going to work, right? It's just not the way that it works. So they lie to the player in order to minimize the roll of luck, because we don't think about luck in the same way. We're in this meritocratic space. Star Wars Galaxy of Heroes is a free-to-play game, right? And it's based on this model where everyone in the game understands that it's pay to win, right? There's this fascinating discourse around it of Kraken, whale, dolphin, minnow, free-to-play, right? And everybody understands that the Krakens aren't necessarily more skilled, they just dump more money into it. So one of the things that was really interesting as a new character was released and a new raid was released is a bunch of the top guilds ended up kicking a bunch of members out that weren't keeping up with the spending. So just like a raiding guild in an MMO would have kicked players out if you weren't showing up, if you weren't performing well, these guilds started kicking people up because they weren't keeping up with their spending habits. They weren't dropping the $300 for each of the two new characters, the $300 for one character, $300 for another character. They weren't keeping up with the Joneses, and that meant that they couldn't compete on the game at the same level. They were holding their guild back, so all of a sudden things happened. Right? It's effectively based on an aristocratic model of pocketbook. That also leads to these really interesting things happening in the community, where the community is really toxic, but not to each other. The community is really toxic to the developers, because the whole point of the game for many players is to outfox and collude against the developers. So right now, I use Discord with a bunch of other people that I collaborate with in order to manipulate the results of a certain kind of thing, because if we competed against each other, it would cost us premium currency, but if we cooperate, we can all maximize our gain, in effect outfoxing the developers. Fascinating stuff, right? So we work together to screw the devs, because that's where we're toxic. Journey, right? Genova-Chen talks explicitly about the fact that one of the things that they were trying to do with the design of Journey was to try to stop people from being jerks to each other. And what could they do in the design of the game? And they felt that the design of most games is what sets us up to be rude. So the design of Journey is set up to try to get us to play with each other nicely or differently by stripping out chat, by not being able to let us compete, by not letting us be able to hurt each other. So I would encourage us to think about, as we move forward through this, what's our obligation? What's the thing that we need to do to start changing these things? What kind of influence can we have on the systems that we've got? Because if these are cultural problems, they need cultural solutions, and that really starts with us. So I'm done. And since she always asks if I talked about her, that's my daughter Piper, and part of her bedtime routine is to play Splatoon, and she's our shot caller. She's getting disturbingly good at Splatoon on her own.
Okay, thank you, Chris. That was quite right. Now we have plenty of time for comments and questions. So who wants to start? Yeah. And maybe, Chris, if you could just quickly repeat the question for the stream. Yeah.
Thanks for this enjoyable lecture. And I think that your diagnosis is spot on, and the solution you presented is very good for multiplayer games. But what about single-player games, which also create some kind of toxicity? Like a good example would be, I've seen a lot of discussions in the forums where people were really pissed off that there is an easy setting in the game, as if it destroyed their experience, even though they had their hard setting. And that's and you just have to look at, you could just look at forums discussing Dark Souls to see that it's very hard to get into the game because people will immediately tell you get good, and that's it. So that's so. Do you have any solutions for toxicity in single player?
So toxicity in single player games. First, I would hesitate. I don't have all the solutions for this stuff, right? This is something where I see a problem going on, and I think it's going to take many of us to solve it. I do think there are single player games that do things differently, though, right? You've got a handful of indie games like Cart Life and Papers, Please, which disempower the player, right? Which make you focus on the ways in which life doesn't work quite the same way, right? Papers, Please is this fantastic thing that's about processing passport applications, and the most efficient way to play the game is to turn everybody down. But that's dark, right? Like turning everybody down, like it puts you in this place where you're asked to make really hard decisions. And the narrative going over the game is you're trying to feed your family, right? So you're placed in this vice that's really kind of interesting for the player that does some interesting stuff. I would hope that as well, games could be developed to start to question the meritocratic model, right? Trying to get us to play different kinds of ways, get us to reflect on different types of things. And then I think that the developers can potentially do some stuff with the community, right? And try to encourage sorts of things. So an upside of the Dark Souls games, right, is sometimes they let you leave notes, sometimes you can do coaching to each other, but I think the community through the reliance on meritocracy has become so toxic and get goody that we need to start thinking about what's our obligation to try to help people get good, right? What's my job to try to help lift that person up rather than just kick them in the face? And I think part of that's because we haven't, as people, as a community of people around games, articulated what it is that we want and what we don't want, right? The norms that have been established are ones that are get goods dominant, and talk a lot about that. Yeah, there's a lot. We've talked for a long time.
Okay. Other questions? Yeah, David?
Thanks for teaching me about Hairdryer Chicken. That's going to be my takeaway. You talk a lot about abuse you got on social media platforms. So I'm curious about your thoughts on how social media platforms like Facebook, Twitter, etc. have these meritocratic principles in them that foster toxic behavior, and to what extent does that overlap? So if you apply your framework ideas to social media platforms, can you? What are your thoughts?
So toxicity on social media platforms and what's going on there. The first thing that I should say, right? First of all, I got really limited abuse, and I would argue that's largely because I'm a straight white guy, right? So there are only so many things, and they died out pretty quickly. That the women that I know that got abused get it in far more violent, harassing, and long-standing ways than dudes, right? So I just get a little bit. I just think that it's interesting for the talk. It gets me from one thing to the next. I think that as far as the social media platforms go, I think you're dealing with a variety of different elements of tech that cause problems, right? One is anonymity is interesting, but after having done some Facebook ads and having the toxicity go there, that it's seemingly linked with a real person, right? I don't know if it's a real person, but they have a name and a face associated with it. That's interesting, right? The kinds of things that we're willing to say online. I think that the design of communities matters, right? Upvoting and downvoting has a real impact on the kinds of ways that things work. I think that Casey O'Donnell and others have talked about brigading and the way that something like Twitter is designed specifically to try to dogpile and do other kinds of things. I don't think that those are so much meritocratic, but I think that there are competition and cultures going on there, and that those systems aren't really good ways to engage deliberative dialogue, right? It's not encouraging us to get reflective, right? There's not a lot of places in online community where we're able to get reflective and think about the kinds of things that we're doing and take a step back. And I think that that's a cost, right? It's not really a meritocratic cost, but I think it feeds into all of this stuff.
So I was thinking about the 80% thing, because in Hearthstone, right, the coin flip at the beginning, Blizzard has talked extensively about how, well, after a time or two, it's not really a coin flip because we're really bad, right? And so is there something, I mean, I hate to say it, but innately human about being bad at the maths?
Sure. Is there something human about being bad at the maths? Sure, right? There's things like loss aversion. There's things like we remember the bad much more than we remember the good. There's definitely something there. But I think that two things are going on in video games that are special. The first thing that's going on in video games that are special is it's been branded as this space where skill should win out. So I don't think that we think about the bad at the math in quite the same way as just being unlucky in life. And then a second thing that I think is baking into that is the computer matters somehow. And I'm not exactly sure how the computer matters, but I think that it gets us to not think about humanity in sorts of quite the same way. So that if I lose to you in a coin flip and we can talk about it, it feels different to me than if we start to do it online, right? We can manage it in different sorts of ways. This makes me think about also the difference between playing a board game with friends versus playing a video game online. And one of the differences about playing a board game with friends is you can change the rules as you go. You can adjust things. You can make differences. One of my favorite soccer games ever was a group that I played with when I was in Alabama. And one of the things that would inevitably happen is if one team started really beating the other, we'd switch, right? And you just move players around because the fun was in playing the soccer, not in or football, depending, right? or whatever we call it in Finnish, right? But the fun was in playing the game rather than in trying to win. And in a rec game, that was really entertaining. But in a video game, it's often harder to do those sorts of things in order to have those sorts of systems. We're placed in this adversarial framework where we don't have the people to kind of resolve those disputes peacefully.
So quick follow-up,
Sure.
Because I think that's a really important point. Levi-Strauss actually has, when he talks about the difference between game and ritual, talks about game as having a disjunctive effect, right? You have a winner and a loser, whereas a ritual is about a conjunctive effect of coming back together, right? And so that's interesting that when we play together here, maybe we're looking for something different than, right? So.
Well, and the game ritual thing also ports into video games in the case of online play versus on your couch play. Right, like when I'm playing Splatoon with Piper, it's different than when I'm online playing against other people, right? When we start to add voice chat and things like that, one of my favorite examples of Toxicity Online that was most amusing to me is I had a class on video games, and I found that there were two students, and their favorite thing to do was to go online, and there were two jobs. One was tasked with playing, and the other was tasked with talking trash. Because talking trash was a game in and of itself that they were playing, and one couldn't both concentrate on the game sufficiently and to trash talk sufficiently. So it was divided up into two different people, and then they're playing off an entirely different game, right? Like they're playing against these people in this other kind of rich way that I think is interesting.
Okay, hi. I came in a bit late, so if my question is due to a misunderstanding because I missed the first part, please forgive me. But I was thinking of the Korean Overwatch player, and in Sweden we have sort of our famous soccer player, Zlatan.
Oh, Zlatan!
I'm thinking of him, and like to me, I don't really see how you end up being critical towards meritocracy, because for me the reason that they can come somewhere despite the social structures, despite they don't have social or cultural capital with them, is because they are in a super meritocratic system that cherishes skill so much. So wouldn't that mean that one way of counteracting toxicity would be to actually make those pay-to-win models into real skill, super skill-based games? I'm just sort of...
Yeah, it's fun.
Yeah.
So I would argue that so I can talk about Zlatan all day. I love Zlatan, and we can talk about Zlatan all day long. Right? Zlatan. I was talking about Zlatan just yesterday. Anything Zlatan is fun. One of the things that I think is like, so if you don't know about Zlatan, right, he comes from a really lower class upbringing. He ends up making himself becomes one of the elite soccer players in the world. Ends up going to after he plays for most of the major teams in Europe. Ends up now he's with the LA Football Club, and he announces himself with an LA Times ad that says, "Dear Los Angeles, you're welcome." Zlatan, baby, right? And he comes into his first game and turns the match, at least in part, on a 40-yard, just ridiculous shot, just absurd, right? So Zlatan is something else. But I would argue that there are two things going on, right? Zlatan is exceptionally skilled. There's no doubt about that. He's at least somewhat hardworking, right? Like I don't know enough about his work ethic to really talk about it. But I would also argue that there are ways in which he was lucky too. What scout found him, who picked him up. And I would argue that basically every sport has their list of players who should have made it that didn't. Or if you talk to athletes, they'll talk about their friends that were better than them, they just didn't get the right break. What system did that top player go into, and how did that help cultivate them into something else? Did they just get lucky with the lack of injury, right? So that while he is exceptionally skilled and probably exceptionally hardworking, there's some element of luck that played into. Now that's different with different kinds of people, but I think that the fact that we don't talk about luck and the role that it plays is what feeds into the meritocracy. So I think that high skill games have their role, but all of us have benefited from luck, some more than others, right? And the fact that we don't talk about that stuff is what kind of shuts down the conversation. So if we were to create a super high skilled game, even when we did that, it's going to advantage certain players over others based on how many games they've played, what kinds of games they've played, how they've gone through life, whether or not they have the money to get to the game in the first place, right? Like Zlatan benefits at least in part because he was in an area where they had soccer fields growing up, right? So that drove him into that, where really he has the build where he could have been an exceptional basketball player. So maybe somewhere else he would have been like a mediocre basketball player rather than an exceptional soccer player. So being in that immigrant community feeds him in certain kinds of ways, right? Now, the fact that we, like, our ability to get Zlatan to be that self-reflective, chances of that are probably zero, but it would be a fun conversation, man. Okay. Thanks for bringing up Zlatan. That's fun.
Yeah, go ahead, Alon.
Hey, just sort of wondering about this sort of lumping video games and sports together, because I think that there are some challenges in doing that. And sort of looking at sports studies, one of the things that they discuss that we discuss very little in game studies is fair play. I mean, that is a huge topic in sports studies and something that is still now being built up in game studies. So do you think that there's something we could actually learn from sports if we look at sports, not just the competition at the highest level, but that's a sort of a slightly
Yes.
you know.
Yes, I think there's plenty that we can learn from sports, and I think that it's understudied in games, or those links aren't made enough. And at least in part, right? One of the things that we're talking about is cultural, right? And one of the differences, the distinctive things you have going on with sports and video games is you've got a jock geek divide, right? And those places don't talk very much, right? We've also got the fact that both in probably, I suspect in sports studies, but definitely in game studies, we study the games that we like. Right? We tend to study the games that we play. That's where we end up, right? If you think about almost all of the touchstone work, we're studying what we find interesting because that's what's fulfilling to us. Now, there are a handful of exceptions to that, people studying things that they don't specifically find interesting, and that's cool too. But we have that kind of bias built in, and that means that we tend to look at some things and not others. And with the kinds of people who circulate in game studies communities, they don't do a lot of sports stuff. So I'm sure there's a ton of stuff. I should probably read more sports studies stuff because I think it'd be fascinating. There's the sports video games book that Mia and crew edited that, sold both copies because everybody in the sports study, everybody interested in sports video games was in the book and got their copy.
Like you.
Yeah.
I bought it.
Okay, we still have time for a couple of questions. Anyone?
Or we have lunch.
Yeah, Chris will be here until Thursday, I believe.
Yeah.
So I mean, you will have plenty of time to have a chat with him. Just a very practical announcement before a round of applause. One thing is that if you're participating in the Making Games seminar, are here for the afternoon workshop, and don't have a name tag yet, you can collect one downstairs in the lobby. Also, if you haven't received your lunch ticket yet, lunch will be the next item in our program. Then you should talk to me because I have a few left. But other than that, I don't know if we have any practical announcements. Once more, thanks, Chris.